Hello everyone, and welcome to our seminar. The theme is evaluation, and we've got three remarkable speakers here for you today. We're really excited, and just before we get kicked off, I want to do a little bit of basic kind of housekeeping stuff. We have, if people require subtitles, there's a live captioner, and you access that by going down the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you should see a little button there for captions. Also, I believe the captioner is going to be able to put a link in the chat at some point with a link to an external page as well, where you can view the captions if that's better for you as well. The plan is to have two of our speakers, then we'll have a short comfort break, and then our third speaker, and then a Q&A. And if at any point during the presentations you have a question or an idea or an intervention you'd like to make, please do put comments and questions in the chat box, and we will save them up for the discussion at the end. Also, in the discussion at the end, people can speak as well. And also, if there's any kind of points of clarification or anything during the presentations, please do also kind of raise a hand and jump in as well if there's a problem or something. I'm going to be monitoring the chat box throughout. We've also got, I should very quickly advertise the next seminars that we've got in our series, the last ones of this year. We have on June the 10th, we have Harriet Cooper, who's going to be talking about her book on disability and childhood, and then on the 1st of July we have a half-day symposium as well on race and healthcare. So please do kind of look out for those, because they're going to be brilliant. I'm not sure that I've got any other kind of additional housekeeping things, so I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Lewis Winks, who will be familiar to many of you. He's currently working on an Engaged Research project in the Geography Department, and he is here in the centre as well as our Engaged Research Facilitator, and has a background in Engaged Research at the Impact, Innovation and Business unit. He also has an allotment and likes to go walking at the weekend. Another thing apart from evaluation and engagement that joins our three brilliant speakers today. So I'm going to hand over to Lewis now. Thank you, Lewis.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen with you. Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. Right. Okay. So yes, I do have an allotment. I do like to get walking. Thank you for including that, Michael. Seemed like very important points. Sort of wish they were the ones you led with, really, but yeah, they always seem important. And I'm going to try and scrape out some kind of metaphor from that. I remember when I was doing my PhD, I found that actually a lot of the time thinking about what was valuable, what was really helpful time for me as a researcher, trying to find my way. Often I would kind of kid myself that it was time spent at my desk and time spent reading papers, and actually kind of reflecting back on the whole process of research. I think the time on the allotment and walking at the weekends was probably where most of the actual work happened. And so I think it's actually quite fitting, really, for what we're going to be talking about, because I think a lot of the value sometimes in these processes happens in the cracks, away from where we often place our focus. So now I've actually managed to shoehorn that part of my introduction into what I'm going to say, I better get on and say it. I'm not going to speak for probably quite as long as everyone else. I'd like to, I suppose, one thing that I feel I can offer to this seminar is maybe some some questions, some ideas. I do have experience of engaged research as a researcher myself, but I also have experience of working in an impact-driven environment on the ref. And so I think for me that helps to provide some helpful contrast, I think, to the kind of work that's happening here at the centre. So I thought it was interesting to consider how Wellcome thinks of in evaluation. I mean, I should say as well, I'm talking very broadly about evaluation. I think we can consider how we apply that to the engagement process, but broadly thinking about reflecting and taking stock and then applying that learning. So I think it's helpful to look at how the trust itself articulates that. And also the NCCPE, that have their own view on that, and it's just a different way of saying the same thing. Thinking about those dynamics, what are the kind of interplays, and how can we apply that reflection back into the processes that we're developing with collaborators and partners. I'll just stop and pause at that point, because I think it's something that I'm really keen to draw out here, is that for me, evaluation is something which is, is really important, but it's probably more important to do it well, and to do it in a way which is appropriate to the needs of the project, to the needs of the culture and the environment that we're working within. And the reason for that, I think, is that this second part of each of these definitions, this learning from experiences, the reflexive process of putting that learning back into practice, feels to be really, really important here. And we'll get on to consider some of the ways in which evaluation might not be always done in that way. So another definition of evaluation, which I think is also helps to broaden this out perhaps a bit more into the realm in which we're here to discuss today, is around empowerment, building trust, and developing those relationships with beneficiaries and involving people further in the processes of research. And so if evaluation can achieve that and help us to achieve that, then it has a really central role to play in engaged research. So I'm keen for us to explore perhaps the ways in which we can make evaluation work for us, rather than be something which we see as a distraction or a bolt-on. So within that definition, it's both practical. It gives us something that we can reflect on and bring back into our practice, but also potentially transformative for those working practices and for the people that we're working with, as well as ourselves. If we're to complete this sentence, I've had a lot of awkward conversations about evaluation in the past, and many of them I think have been justified, and I definitely want to spend some time here to consider the ways in which we construe and think about evaluation before considering some of the benefits. So coming from working on impact case studies and with the REF process, it's very much seen, and I think this is fair, but often seen rather as a linear journey. And if we were to look at impact as a linear journey, then we might think about how Y results from X intervention or project or resource. And so often in the work that I've been involved with, we've thought about how to capture that. How do we capture the experiences that participants have had, the experiences that collaborators have had through this process, and we arrive at an endpoint, and then the project ends. So that can be a point of criticism. And again, related to that, how might we, see evaluation as something which is a bolt-on rather than integrated into a project? A lot of conversations are around funding, and I think as we see engaged research becoming bigger part of what funders are looking for. We'll see evaluation of those processes of working being a more central part of what we're trying to do. But I think that comes with the caveat of just being careful that we're not just evaluating for the sake of looking at ways of creating further funding. It's certainly important, but probably shouldn't be what we lead with. It's a waste of time, contrasted with it's always necessary. So I'll leave those with you, not necessarily my views, just some provocations, perhaps for discussion later. I'd also like to give you some reasons not to evaluate, and I suspect this will come up as well, should we be evaluating? Certainly there's a danger of decentering the relationship that we have with collaborators. Where are we placing the emphasis of our work? Are we actually doing the work that needs to be done, or are we doing work which is being asked of us from our institutions or funders? And really those two things, I suppose, should be the same, but just to be careful of where we're putting the emphasis. Capacity on projects, I mean, evaluation is something which it will just fill the space that we give it. And so this needs to be in here, really. A good reason not to evaluate might be that we just simply don't have capacity to do it well. And going back to that first point, if we don't have the capacity to actually bring that learning back into practice, why are we evaluating ways of working with people? If we're over asking of collaborators, we're putting at risk the trust which is built up. And if we're putting emphasis on outputs rather than processes working, there's a further question over that. Is this actually going to be detrimental to the way in which we would like to work? And to put this another way, are we asking the right questions? Are we sure we have the right questions? Are we missing things out because of the questions that we're asking? Okay, so that's that. But you still want to evaluate engagement processes, which is fine. So we've got through that. And perhaps I'll give you some reasons why we might like to do this. So I think one of the principal reasons is to create a set of a shared remit in which to work, and that includes the ways in which we would like to involve ourselves and others within that work. So creating a vision, evaluation relies on a vision because we need to be able to check back against that. And so setting those parameters, those expectations, is a really good reason to evaluate because it creates a set of checks and balances against which we can measure our progress. So again, thinking further down the line, we're going to, as the project gets underway, where do the challenges emerge? Where are the opportunities to do things better, to build in these feedback loops? And I think that needs to be in here as a massive positive, because if we're simply working to research objectives and not to a shared vision, then how do we make the most of opportunities as they emerge most effectively? And something else which has come up and what comes up again and again is where the power is, and identifying where asymmetry of power relationships are. If we are striving to create a vision which is shared, then we're much more likely to identify where we're perhaps not working with symmetrical power relationships. So having said all that, it seems to me that it's difficult to make a distinction because of engaged ways of working should already be building these things in. Then really there's a question of what's the rationale for evaluating in this way. And I suppose this is where it comes down to an opportunity for evaluation to work for the project and for it to be in of itself an engaged way of working. So we've talked about the co-development of a vision. and mutual parameters. But thinking about what is where are the limits of where we're working? Is there a limit to what we feel can be achieved, and identifying those limits, setting expectations. With evaluation, we need to obviously identify a point at which some capacity is going to be diminished. So we need to think about what does success look like, and I think that's a really good question to ask at the very beginning. But in 12 months' time, 18 months' time, 36 months' time, whatever it might be, when we're looking back, what realistically within these parameters does success look like? And it's a really difficult question to ask, but I think it's a really exciting question as well, because it gives us potential for achievable aims. It removes some of the problems of feeling that we're being let down when a process starts to wind down. And it allows us then to look back against what we said would be the hallmark of success along the way, and putting in place those feedback loops that I mentioned earlier. Bringing other voices into the research. So if we were to use feedback and perhaps sense check ideas against with other collaborators who don't have a central role within research, and it's enabling those other people or organisations to have a voice within the research. And I think in terms of where this goes beyond a particular project or focus, then this provides the opportunity to then showcase a way of working. What went well, what didn't go well, how would we suggest working in the future? And I think that's a community such as this one, such as this centre, that's where this could really be powerful, because we could really start sharing some important learning. And I know that's already happening a lot through groups which exist and seminars such as this. And again, not just thinking about kind of from the research-centric point of view, but thinking about those partnerships. How might we see opportunities for other people to become involved, increasing capacity across sectors and so on. So it might not be researchers that take the lead with evaluation. It might, of course, be co-researchers in the community, collaborators. There are different points of ownership that could be taken along this process as well. So I see that as a potential opportunity. These almost kind of go without saying, but there are some clear challenges which we've mentioned before, which I think is worth bringing up again here. These are definitely going to put the brakes on potential for evaluating. So I'm just going to end with some key questions, things which I think we should be asking, which we should be placing at the centre of any consideration of doing evaluation. Is it necessary? Going back to, is it going to be doing more harm than good? Do we have a shared vision? Can we somehow refine what success looks like and revisit that along the way? Do we have the capacity to carry it out? And do we have the capacity to put reflection back into practice? Where's the ownership and who benefits, and how would you find out? And so just to end with this point really, which kind of underscores the caution that has run through what I've been trying to say, is that if we're saying that evaluation is an empowering part of the way in which we're working, then really we need to be able to make sure that it is. And in order to make sure that, I suppose, we've got meaningful evaluation in place, we need to make sure it's not tokenistic, it's not taking advantage of communities we work with. And I think there's, what I haven't talked about is particular kind of methodologies of evaluating. There's lots of good examples out there, but it's also based on the individual's ability to put this into practice, I think. And there's just some further reading if people are interested in anything that's come up. So thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Katrina and Kristina have to say as well, and any discussion which comes up later. Thank you.
Thanks, Lewis. That's fantastic. Really interesting. Lots to kind of think about. And I hope that's going to, particularly those key questions at the end, are going to feed into the conversation we have. Could I ask you to stop sharing your screen?
Yes, absolutely.
Lovely. It's amazing. And now I'm going to hand over to Katrina Wyatt, who will be familiar to most, if not all of you, as a researcher in the medical school here and at the centre, with a wealth of experience in engaged research and evaluation. So, Katrina.
Oh, you didn't mention the allotment, Michael.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I apologise. And another proud allotment as well. There's our enduring theme of evaluation and self-reliance.
Well, thank you, and apologies, because I know we've lived in this virtual existence for 14 months, but I'm still as tech unsavvy at the beginning as I at the end as I am at the beginning. Let me just see if I can share my screen. Sorry, just need to go to slideshow. Can people see that?
Yeah.
Yep. Fantastic. And thank you, Lewis. Really enjoyed your talk, and I think mine's going to follow sort of very similar structure. So thinking a little bit about what evaluation means, thinking a bit about what engaged research is, and then thinking about what the practice of evaluating engaged research might be. And I'm so grateful for you for inviting me to do this, because I don't read enough, and this really provoked me actually to go and read some papers that I should have and have been wanting to look at for years, and fall down several rabbit holes about evaluation, what I think it is, what I think it isn't, as well as engaged research, and also to think a little bit about assessment and measurement, and hence the sort of subtitle. I was trying to be a bit clever here, and Galileo to Goethe, but just thinking about the science of evaluation, if you like. So similar to Lewis, I started with, well, what is evaluation? And I started with the Oxford English Dictionary, oh, I'm so sorry. I've just, previous slide, who talk about it as, who define it as forming an opinion of the amount, value, or quality of something about after thinking about it carefully. I'm slightly anxious whether people do think about it very carefully, but that's probably for another time. But what are we trying to do when we talk about evaluating engaged research? Are we trying to measure it? Are we trying to assess its quality? Are we trying to demonstrate its value? Or are we trying to do all of those and more? So if we see evaluation in terms of assessment and measurement, you know, it does provoke us, as Lewis has said, to think about what is it we're measuring, for whom, and why. So I then fell down another rabbit hole of looking at some quotes on measurement and assessment. And these first two quotes are very much about, almost, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Measurement is a form of control which leads to improving. You need to be able to measure something in order to understand it. You know, and all of this, when I think about these two quotes and engaged research, it makes me a bit anxious, because I'm not sure that the process, the doing of engaged research, should be restricted to what we can measure. And I would worry then that it would lead to quite restrictive practices of engaged research in terms of what we can then measure as outcomes. So a bit similar to this quote about measurement determining how one does something rather than being a means of understanding the nature and quality of a process. And then, because I live with a philosopher, I was amazed to find Nietzsche wrote about evaluation, and a happy quote. You know, one doesn't normally think, well, I don't, of Nietzsche as a happy person, but evaluation is creation. Hear it, you creators. Evaluation itself is itself the most valuable treasure of all that we value. It is only through evaluation that value exists. And without evaluation, the nut of existence would be hollow. Hear it, you creators. So actually, I started to get really excited then about the possibilities of evaluation. And a starting point, I think, for any evaluation is a description of the phenomena that you're trying to understand. And this is where I started to feel a lot more secure, because I'm clear in my own head what engaged research means for me. And they are that. I haven't just Googled that image and put it in. That's the three sisters. You plant a bean and a sweet corn and a squash. And the squash provides the ground cover, and the sweet corn is the stick by which the bean grows up. So engaged research, for me, it's a process of doing research. It's not an add-on, it's not a separate discipline. It's about sharing power and control with people throughout the research process. And it very much starts from a position of people have a democratic right to be involved or engaged in research. So I think as academics, we have a responsibility to ensure that our structures and processes in higher education allow for equality of engagement, that they're as inclusive as they possibly can be. But if we believe that engaged research is about social justice, is about sharing power, what does this mean for what we should be evaluating? And again, I think Lewis, you talked about this. You know, whose outcomes are we evaluating? Do we need to evaluate its impact? And how can we capture impact without reducing the process of engaged research to an instrumental process? Just a quick aside, I always get sort of imposter syndrome whenever I'm asked to do a talk and think, God, I don't know why anyone's asked me. I know nothing about this. And I was thinking, I've hardly done any work on evaluation. And then I actually looked, and I have actually done quite a lot of work on evaluation, some of which I have blanked, which I don't have time to go into. And I'm certainly not going to go through all of these slides, but these is a range of sort of both formal assessments of programs, process and outcome, through to developing guidance on for the Medical Research Council on how we might want to think about evaluating the impact of patient and public involvement in research. That piece of guidance was so complicated, I don't think anyone has ever read it, let alone try and think about how they might use it in their practice. So the slightly uncomfortable realization that actually I have been involved in quite a lot of evaluations of engaged research or involvement in research. Made me pretty sure there was a whole body of academic work in this area that I personally hadn't engaged with. And there is, and I think Kristina may be going to touch on this, but to date there's 65 frameworks concerned with doing engaged research across different disciplines and areas. And there's 27 different evaluation tools out there for assessing involvement or engagement in research and decision making. So, it seems to me that we started off 20 years ago when patient and public involvement in research was sort of at its early stages, developing frameworks for thinking about how we how we practice engaged research. And we've then moved on to thinking about, well, what happens when, what could the impact be of us doing engaged research? But, again, and I think, this was something you were speaking to, Lewis. I think a lot of the frameworks see engagement as an intervention in and of itself. And this is where I think we're sort of in Galileo territory, that we can measure its effect. We can probably state a priori what outcomes we want from the process of engagement, quantify them. And, this sort of slightly instrumental approach to engagement there's full of claims of it in the literature. Engaging people in helping design the research, deliver the research, has led to more people being involved as research participants, more appropriate outcome measures, questions, better dissemination. That is not to diss any of this, but the frameworks seldom assess conflicts and tensions that can arise in doing engaged research. And when frameworks do discuss empowerment of partners, confidence, self-esteem, it's often what academics measure these concepts to be, rather than our partners defining what these concepts might mean to them. So what might an evaluation of engagement as a research process of sharing power and control look like? Well, for me, and again, I know this is something you were saying, Lewis, this, first of all, make sure that by engaging people as partners, we're not doing any harm, we're not causing distress. I think it's really important to understand that and assess whether there is mutual benefit for all, whether our community or public partners are benefiting from being part of the engaged research. I have no problem with evaluation as a means to justify to funders the time and costs of doing meaningful engaged work. And, maybe if we can think about different ways of capturing the process of engagement and outcomes, we can demonstrate the transformative potential of doing engaged research. And of course, I think, within projects, evaluation as engaged reflective practice to enable learning is really important. So these are the questions that I ask myself within the engaged work that I do. So first, sorry, this is quite linear in terms of timescales. So from the outset, have I negotiated the research with the communities, the populations the research is about? And have I done this before we submit it for funding? Does it include interests, issues of interest to people? So when we move into delivering the project, I think it's really important to think about whether the communication channels are there to hear about what is or isn't working in our research practice. Is there clarity about roles and responsibilities regarding project delivery? And that's not the same, I think, as constraining how people can be engaged. It's just being clear what everyone's role is in the project. Have we thought about, because we often think about the initial relationship building stage and then the delivery stage, but then there's a sort of post-project follow-on phase where we've delivered the research, but we're still holding relationships. We're still working with our community partners. And how do we negotiate that follow-on phase? Do people want to be engaged in co-creating a new piece of work, or are people had enough of research and wanting to move on? So I think that is an important phase that we don't tend to think about very much. I would hope that community partners could see how they've influenced the design and the delivery of the research. And after, or during as well as after, I sort of think about the process of doing engaged research and whether the systems and structures in higher education are supporting it or hindering it, and how can we try and create inclusive systems and support structures. So then I started to think of, instead of thinking about evaluation per se, which to me tends to be end focused, could we think about doing evaluability assessments of our engaged research projects and practice? And these are when people come together to develop a shared understanding about the project or about the engaged research process. We could develop a shared understanding of what good engagement would look like, what success would look like for that project, what the values and principles are of doing the engaged research. And then you could agree a set of process and outcome indicators that you could look at to see whether the engaged research was whether you were doing it as you'd hoped for and according to the principles. And then this evaluability assessment, you could use this to support the team to gather the information and develop the feedback loops for sharing learning and changing practice. So just a couple of final thoughts. At first, slightly the potential pitfalls of evaluating engaged research, the sort of so-called swampy lowlands. You know, I think there is a real danger that we're moving to a place, because engagement in research involvements become mainstream, that funders aren't seeing partners as people interested in the research, but almost as participants, and that we're having to demonstrate representativeness of community partners rather than ensuring that the practice is inclusive to all. And certainly I've been told to rewrite an involvement strategy to ensure that to go back and involve people from different ethnic backgrounds, because it wasn't representative of the population, even though it was representative of the issue that we were working on together. I think there is another danger that we may have to, there's a trope in health service research that being involved as a participant in the research is good for your health. So it doesn't matter in a trial if you get the placebo or the new treatment, that actually just being involved in the trial means you'll get more attention and you'll have better health outcomes. And I'm really worried that we're going to start seeing engagement in these terms. And there was 18 months ago some mood music from Wellcome Trust that they wanted to understand the health and well-being outcomes for people we're engaging with as partners. And I think if we think of engaged research as the norm and mainstream, then we may be tempted to think that the structures and processes are there to support this culture, and hence we don't look at those when we evaluate the engaged research. But I think there's loads to be really, really positive about. I think NIHR Involve have come up with some indicators for involvement rather than assessment frameworks. So these are set of standards, and you, sorry, it's gone really dark and I can't actually quite see my notes which say what they are. So they look at communication, governance, impact, working together, support and learning, inclusive opportunities. And they encourage you to co-create the standards for your own project. And that feels like a really interesting way of thinking about evaluation. And so if we do move to a place where doing engaged research is the culture, then I actually think universities are going to have to develop the structures, systems and processes to support this. I really like this idea of evaluation as creation. And if we can think about and develop ways and means of creative evaluation, then I think this could open up new possibility spaces for doing engaged research, which I think would be awesome. And finally, and this in the last sentence is where Goethe comes in, maybe opening up debates around evaluation will make us creative in our thinking about how we capture and evidence transformational engagement. And Goethe talks about a science of qualities, which I think would sit very nicely alongside a science of objective measurement. And maybe thinking about evaluating engaged research could be a way of thinking about how we develop that science of qualities. So that's me. Thank you. I'm sorry, I think I've taken up too much time, but those are the references.
Absolutely perfect. I think we're almost exactly to the minute, perfectly on time. So it's wonderful. Thank you. Fantastic. Well, it's 8 minutes to. I'm hoping that everyone is back and sufficiently comfortable. And so I'd just like to introduce our third speaker, Kristina Staley, who is the Director of TwoCan Associates, a specialist consultancy in patient and public involvement in health and care research. And she brings 20 years of experience in this area, and also upping the ante on the allotments of our previous speakers as a third of an acre in the garden. And being a completely city person, I really have no idea how big a third of an acre is. I have literally no sense of space.
Too big some days.
Okay. Lovely. Thank you so much, Kristina. Really looking forward to to hearing your presentation. I also know at some point you're going to want some involvement as well from people. So you're going to give me the nod, and you want me
I'll
to
give
do
you the nod.
unmute
Yeah.
people. So there'll be a moment, everyone, when you'll be invited to chip in. Thank you so much. Fantastic.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me. Evaluation is one of my favorite things. So I'm really pleased, and I've really enjoyed those presentations. There's going to be a lot to talk about, and it will be here all night. So let me just share my screen, show my slides. Okay, is that all right? Everyone can see that? Okay, great. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about how to do it. Based on my experience of having done quite a bit of evaluation. I'm often asked to come in as a sort of independent person to evaluate different types of involvement, all sorts of projects and organisations. And I counted up, I've written about 120 case studies of impact. So I think I'm drawing on that kind of experience when I'm talking today. So, there we go. So I'm just going to talk a bit about why evaluate involvement in research, a bit about how involvement works. I think that has implications for the tools and the measures that Katrina was talking about, and finish up with my pet approach for evaluating involvement. So when a client asks me in to come and do some evaluation, one of the first things I do is sit down with them and say, exactly why do you want to do this? Why do you want to evaluate it? And these are the common reasons people want to do it. They want to describe what they've been doing. So it's a sort of reporting process. They want to assess whether things have changed over time, whether they're monitoring change. They've got more projects with involvement now than they did a few years ago, that kind of question. To learn what's working well or what can be done better. So talking about improving practice, to assess whether good practice is being followed, auditing against standards. We've talked about these already. To justify funding, doing some kind of cost benefit analysis, or wanting to find out what difference it's making. So sort of assessing impact. And quite often people say, I want to do all of that. And that's an enormous amount of work. So I often try to get people to focus on one or two things and then to tailor their approach according to their needs. So there's different ways of capturing these different kinds of information. And the other key question is who will use what you find? Often, who's going to be the audience for your results? Sometimes it's an informal learning process like we talked about earlier, or sometimes people are saying, we've learned something, we want to share it with other researchers in our field, we want to get this into a journal article, and therefore that's a different kind of process again. So evaluation often ranges from sort of very informal shared learning right through to rigorous academic research, and it encompasses all those kinds of approaches. So there's not one approach to all of this. And the other thing that usually happens to me is people say, we just finished our 3-year multi-million-pound project with involvement and it's been brilliant, and we've got £3.50 left in the budget, and we'd like you to come back, come in and prove how brilliant we've been. And there's a limit what you can do then at that point. And I think, as the speakers already talked about, what's really important is you plan this from the beginning, you resource it properly, and you plan to use the learning in real time. So if you wait till the end, you've got no chance of improving what you're doing as you're going along. So I think it's really important to think about it up front. And then the other sort of frequent question I get is, is there a toolkit we can use to do this? Or would you please develop a toolkit for us? And my heart sinks always at that point. So I think there's about £1 million, I reckon, of public money has been spent on developing various toolkits. And I'm not convinced any of them are really useful. And to explain why I think that, I'd like to go in and looking a bit about how involvement works. So for me, in terms of how involvement impacts on research, I think it all comes down to learning. And I think researchers learn from patients and carers' experiential knowledge. And when researchers gain knowledge and skills through that experience of involvement, that often changes their priorities and values and attitudes, which then changes what they do and changes the research or changes the research culture. So I'd like to spend a little time talking about experiential knowledge, what it is and how it works. I just want to show you a few slides that I developed with the University of Exeter PPI team for patient training on how involvement works. So this is where I need everyone to be off mute now. Can you do that for us, Michael? Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I think everyone's off mute.
Okay. So what's wrong with this picture?
Clock face.
Clock face, very good. Some people say it's the Houses of Parliament, but anyway, yeah. Yeah, the clock face was missing. Okay. What's wrong with this picture?
Blue skies in England.
That's true. Well, yeah, it's this. This is the Argentinian Houses of Parliament. And the point that I would say at this point is if we had someone from Argentina in the room, they would spot immediately that that great big tower was missing just as quickly as we spotted that the clock face was missing. So your experience, your knowledge you gain from your lived experience gives you insights that other people might not have. And I think for me, researchers are often in the position of looking at this picture and not knowing anything's wrong. So if I hadn't have said to you what's wrong with this picture, you wouldn't be looking. So because there are gaps in our knowledge, we often make assumptions which might be ill-informed and might be the wrong assumptions. Or we have gaps in our knowledge that we just don't know, that we're not aware of. So we don't know what we don't know a lot of the time. And what involvement does is patients bring in that knowledge, they fill those gaps, they challenge those assumptions, and that can be transformative. And when that happens, researchers often describe it as a kind of light bulb moment or a penny drop moment. And those to me are the kind of important impacts for involvement. So I just want to look at that in a bit more depth. And I've got a few case studies to show you. This is a bit linear. These are quite simple ones, but it can be, you know, lots of different circles going on. But this is I think these illustrate some important points. So in this first case study, the researchers had a proposal to look at the socioeconomic impact of carpal tunnel syndrome. And they went and consulted a group of people with musculoskeletal conditions and presented their proposal and asked for feedback. And during the conversation, one of the patients mentioned that she'd lost her job because of carpal tunnel syndrome, because she was a phlebotomist and she no longer had any fine finger movement. And this was a revelation to the researchers. They hadn't appreciated that there could be an impact on work. They hadn't included that in their research design, even though they were looking at the socioeconomic impacts of a health condition. But they changed their research design and included that. And they said this was responsible then for their funding application being successful. And you could argue that actually the research was then more relevant to patients because it was including all aspects of the impacts of that health condition. And when I first read this, I was thinking, really? Did they really not think that, you know, there could be an impact on work life, when that's something I hear from patients all the time? But then I took a step back and thought, well, actually, maybe we don't know anything about these researchers, and maybe they're junior researchers and they're learning this for the first time. That's okay. Maybe they are health economists. They haven't worked in this area before. They assumed carpal tunnel syndrome wasn't so serious it would lead to job loss. Again, that's okay. They had to learn it. So if involvement is about learning, it did its job, and there's no judgment in what anyone has to learn. And for me, it illustrates the fact that this is a subjective experience. It comes down to those researchers. Another set of researchers might have gone in with a different proposal and wouldn't have learnt the same thing. So it's a subjective experience, and it's unpredictable. So they didn't walk in the room, think we've got to find out about work experience. They didn't know that was what was missing from their proposal. So it's subjective and unpredictable. Here's the other thing about the learning is it's two-way. So this is an example from a Parkinson's UK project. And this was a project where it was a massive national study. They were looking at quality of life, impact of Parkinson's, and they were sending out huge volumes of quality of life questionnaires all over the country, asking people to fill them out. And it was very patchy. So some places were filling them all out and some places weren't. And the professor went back to Parkinson's UK, who were funding the study, and said, I've got a problem here. I'm not getting the data I need. Can we have an involvement group to help me work out what's happening? I think there's a problem with the research nurses. And he flew in all these people from all over the country, put them up in a hotel, had a whole day looking at this to find to see what the problem was. And during that workshop, one of the patients said, do you really look at every single answer to every question? And the professor said, yes, because they're all, I have to know them all because all these tools have been validated. So I have to get answers to all of them. And the patient said, oh, that's amazing. I didn't realize you looked, that's an incredible amount of work. He'd learned something about how the questionnaires worked. And he said, but you don't say it in the explanation of what we need to do. And that was the penny drop moment for that professor. They hadn't written in the explanation that you have to answer every single question. So he changed that. They got better data, better study, more impact. So I think what's important there is that the conversation is, the learning can be two-way. So it's about all of the people who are involved in the process, and the impact is on all of them. So it's about finding out what happens to everyone involved, not just the kind of tangible outcomes. And that's illustrated by this example as well, final one. This was a study where the researcher was looking at the interventions to improve the health of looked after children. It was a systematic review. And what she did is she brought together a group of young adults who'd left care homes to help with her on the whole project all the way through. And when they got to the point where they were looking at the literature that already existed, the young people got really upset and angry. And they said all of the research looks at looked after children and young offenders and groups them together. And we are not young offenders. We haven't done anything wrong. Why are you lumping those people together all the time? So the researcher couldn't justify that. It had a profound impact on her personally, changed the language she used for the rest of her study, but also changed the language she used with her peers in every conference she went to subsequent to that. So she was trying to get the rest of the field to change their approach as well. So it had so I'd say that's a big impact on the kind of research culture as well. So a less tangible thing than the outcomes we typically look at when we're evaluating impact. So the problem with tools then, I think personally, is they're trying to objectify and quantify and produce evidence because that's the culture we work in, So we think we have to measure everything. And so what happens is the tools tend to focus on the changes, the tangible changes and the impact on culture and conditions, those kind of outcomes, and very little of the context, none of the impacts on the people, learning and otherwise, really gets a look in. And because of that, what they often do is try to categorize all the kinds of impacts there could possibly be. And so what they end up with is masses of tick boxes. So I've seen them with like 10 pages of tick boxes where you tick the impact that you've experienced, which becomes impossible to use. Or they boil it down to such kind of broad categories, it sort of starts to become meaningless and you don't really know what happened. And you rarely get the information from those tools that you need to understand the story. So with the carpal tunnel one, there's nothing about the researchers and who they were and why they needed to learn that information. There's also been a recent study by Trish Greenhow on frameworks and looking at how they've been used, so where they've been reported subsequently in the literature. And what she found was the frameworks had only been used by the people who developed them. Because in trying to kind of reduce this complexity and the context-dependent nature of it, it becomes something that you don't really understand unless you've been part of producing it. And so each of these tools almost needs to come with an interpreter or a facilitator to help other people use them. So I'm not a big fan of the tools, you've probably gathered that. So my personal view is, in order to capture impact and describe what's happened, it's much more useful to tell the story. Storytelling is natural, it comes easily. It can deal with complexity, context, people, and changes over time. You know, the examples I've given are really linear, small ones, but there are examples where involvement in one project has had an impact on a much later project, years later, not immediately on the project where the people were involved. And stories, you can tell that story over time, and people remember stories. That's the other advantage of them. And there's lots of different ways to tell stories, but the one I found particularly useful and is currently being evaluated by the National Institute of Health Research, NIHR, is called the Most Significant Change Technique. And it's come from the international development field. It's developed by a guy called Rick Davis, who was working in Bangladesh and was doing some rural development work and wanted a tool to assess that complex intervention, I suppose. And it's very simple. It involves asking people, what's the most significant change for you as a result of this experience, this project, whatever you're evaluating. I used it at a biomedical research centre in Oxford and invited people to respond in any way they liked. And it was amazing. People came back with poems and pictures and very rich stories that profoundly affected everybody who heard them. So and the NIHR has been doing some of the work with it in conferences and things. So it can be useful. But the absolute key thing about it is, after you've collected all those stories by asking people about their most significant change, you bring those stories to a group of stakeholders and they read them together and interpret them and agree what the implications are for practice or impact or whatever the issue is. So there's a process of actually processing the stories. It's not just gathering them. So I think evaluation then of involvement, it needs to be tailored to context, because everything about involvement is so context specific. It's important to be clear about the purpose or the purposes, to be clear about the audience, and then develop an approach that meets your needs, your specific needs. I would advocate for collecting stories of impact rather than trying to measure it. And importantly, including the step of interpretation and agreeing implications. Because I said I've written 120 case studies, but I have no idea if anyone has read them or if they've been useful to anyone and anything's changed as a result. So for me, that's the crucial thing. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. There's so much there, and I'm sure lots of people have got different questions and comments they want to come in with. I'm wondering if people would like to put their cameras on and put their hands up if they want to jump in. There are a couple of comments as well in the chat box. Yeah, please do put your hand up, and sorry, when I say put your hand up, I mean your kind of little Zoom hand, and put your camera on if you'd like to jump in with a question. I can read a comment that was in the comment box to kick things off. Something from Richard. Some of you may know of commoncauseresearch.com, an AHRC project which tried to give voice to experiences of university BME third sector collaborations. There are some great video case studies on their site which use visual story and narrative to evaluate the success and impact of this collaborative research. So that's that very neatly ties into impact, just where the last presentation wound up, but actually the comment came from much earlier on in the session. I don't know, Richard, if you want to if you want to say more about those stories there and how they were used.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Oh, it's Michael? Yeah, I think Michael. Yeah, it was a project a few years ago now, I think the goal was really to I mean, a lot of these collaborations go under the radar, and people don't know, you know, how to evaluate the success of these collaborations, and particularly with BME communities. So that was really the impetus behind the project. And some of these videos, I mean, it's I think what our last speaker was talking about in terms of storytelling, in terms of evaluating engaged research, and I think they're very effective. I don't quite know how you might sort of weave that into you know, an audit or, you know, some sort of document, because obviously they're a virtual thing, you know, and audio visual. But anyway, it's very interesting. So
yeah, jump in,
did you
Kristina.
get
I just want to say, having, you know, tried to get people to talk about stories for years and years and years, and everyone was saying, oh no, it's not evidence, we can't use it, how could you possibly use it? I sat in a meeting where the NHR researcher was presenting the most significant change, and there was a Department of Health person sat next to me who was blown away by it and saying, oh, these stories are so useful. And that's the first time I'd ever heard someone from the Department of Health say anything like that. And I think it is about how you interpret and make sense of them rather than just capturing the stories. That's the key element to it.
Kristina, can I ask Kristina a question? Is that okay? I mean, thank you. I loved your presentation and completely agree with you. But I think until we get the commissioners of research to be part of that, listening to the interpretation and sense making of the stories, I think they're still going to end up, even if their hearts tell them the stories are the right way of evidencing impact, how do we stop them defaulting back to how many people were engaged? Were they representative? You know, that sort of easier to capture, if you like, more instrumental.
Okay, so personally, I think it's okay to capture some numbers. You know, you might do that. You know, you might be saying how many projects had involvement. When we had 3 last year, we've got 20 this year. That suggests things are improving. So some descriptive stats, okay, but they don't really tell you very much. And I think that's the problem. If you've got you know, if you've got one university, 70% have got an improvement in their patient information sheets because of involvement, and the other one's got 30%. Doesn't mean they're doing better. They might just have really crap patient information sheets. So they need more involvement. So it's the measurement doesn't tell you very much. So I think it's about helping that interpretation. But the other thing I think is important is to go back to experiential knowledge and its value. And once you really start to unpick that and understand how it's used, then you start to see that representative is not important. Because if you haven't got the people in the room with the relevant experiential knowledge, you won't get the learning. And so I would challenge representativeness on that basis.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And sorry, just one further thought, because certainly in health service research now, all the funding proposals ask the question, how were patients and the public, service users, carers, involved in the design of this proposal? And then how will they be involved in the delivery of the proposal? But that feedback loop really doesn't get closed, in that when you submit your end of project report, you may have to just fill out that we did this and this, but it doesn't, as far as I understand, ever get matched up with what you said you were going to do. Whereas I think if you said you were going to do a randomized control trial and then you went for a realist evaluation, you know, they'd be hopping all over you.
Yeah. I think judging the quality of involvement proposals is jolly difficult. There isn't a standardized way of doing that. And I've also noticed that it's really easy to describe a fantastic process and actually it have no impact because the researchers didn't listen to what people said. So it requires a lot more than simply describing what you're going to do. It's about your intention and your ability to change your plans in response to what you hear. And that bit, I think, is the bit that needs to be brought out. Those stories of the learning need to be brought out, and that isn't part of the feedback process yet.
Thank you.
Can't see any. Oh, I can see a hand up there. Anne. And please,
yeah, sorry, it just takes a while to find the right button. Thank you. I enjoyed all the papers very much. Thank you very much, everybody. And I'm hearing you speak. I wonder, is there an issue about funding? You know, who funds the research as to how it's received? Because certainly some of the things you're describing there, Katrina, I haven't found with the funders that I would deal with say ESRC or Nuffield in particular. I mean, they're very, very receptive to ethnographic approaches or certainly mixed methods. And in a way, it strikes me that we have to remember that it depends who we're talking to with the research, and to be smart about using the right combination of engagements, if you like, to speak to the right audiences if you're trying to change things, you know, be that in that as a matter of health policy, or in my world, you know, you're dealing with the Law Commission or the Ministry of Justice or whatever, and I think you have to think hard about who your stakeholders are, who you're engaging. So that was one point. And the other thing Katrina, you made the statement that people have a democratic right to be involved in research, which sort of intrigued me. I mean, it sounds wonderful, and I want to sort of agree. And then you start thinking about it, and you think, well, you know, if you're trying to, you always end up with some sort of representativeness or purposive selection of samples to represent that view. I mean, if everybody wanted to be involved, you'd have to do quantitative, less engaged in that sense research. Or have I sort of completely misunderstood what you're saying? Because I don't know how you deliver that without going to stakeholders who will not exactly represent communities, but where communities do participate in a meaningful way, so that you're not just speaking for them, but you're getting, for want of a better expression, a bottom-up approach to this. But to have everybody having a democratic right to be engaged, I mean, what does that mean? How do you interpret that in the way that you're doing? I can see maybe if you're talking about patients in healthcare context, that's one thing. But I still then can't see, I think you lose the engagement if you're giving everybody the right, perhaps. I don't know. How do you possibly cope with it, I suppose? I mean, but maybe I'm just misunderstanding what you're saying.
Can I jump in first, and then Lewis, Kristina? So there used to be, and this is going back 15, 20 years, sort of almost two schools of thought around, and this is involving people as partners rather than the sort of participant end of generating data from people. And there was one that our institute director was absolutely clear. He involved people as partners in his research design and delivery because it made his research better. He got, if patients wrote participant information sheets rather than academics, more people were likely to take part in his research as participants. And I just come at it from a different point of view, that this is taxpayers' money, that people, that it's not that sort of slightly instrumental, it makes our research better, although I absolutely believe it does. I do believe people have a right to be involved in research. And I've never ever had the case where I've had people desperate, you know, queues of people wanting to be engaged. Most people don't have the time, most people aren't interested, most people have better things to do in their lives. But one of the things we did very early on with Focus was to create networks of patients and carers who are interested in research, of practitioners delivering services and academics, and just talk about projects that we could do together, and seek for funding to do together. So I mean, I've never been in the position where loads and loads of people have wanted to engage as partners, but I can't imagine ever being in the position where I would say I would choose. And then, you know, so if we were in the position where 15 people wanted to work with us to design and deliver a project, take all 15. Oh, fantastic.
Okay, so I suppose, I mean, it comes down to costs sometimes. I mean, I certainly have been in that position where everybody wants to get involved, and you do have to choose. So then you have to be careful how you choose and include other people as much as you possibly can, and invite them to other events. But yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends what you're doing, and I suppose that's the point, you know, how you have to pick the right methods and the right approach for the right research questions that you're initially taking, but on which you clearly want to co-create a project. So
can I bring Kristina in there?
Yeah, I think we talk about involvement in research as if research is one thing, and I think it comes down to the type of decision you're making. And democratic decision making is often about sharing power. So say you're doing a genetic study on Downs, you want to involve people with that experience, they have that experiential knowledge in that project, and they have a right to be there in a way, because the research results will have a direct impact on their lives. So it's not only that they're helping design better research and improve the research, but in a way they have a right to influence those decisions because they will be directly impacted by them. If you're looking at, I don't know, social policy around how you use the outcome of that genetic research for general health service delivery or something like that, you may want to have a democratic decision-making process where citizens come in who don't have a direct interest in the results, because it's about allocating resources fairly for the benefit of society as a whole. Then you want citizen engagement or public engagement to influence that kind of decision. So I think it's very, very context specific about who you need to involve and what they're contributing. But for me, the involvement in research is often about people with the relevant experiential knowledge, and that's what we need to focus on. Is that?
No, thank you. I mean, that makes absolute sense. And it is obviously very context specific, of course, but all fantastic work. I know you all do fantastic work. I'm just trying to apply it to some of the situations where I find myself doing research, where perhaps it's less clear, but very inspiring and important to try and weave it in.
I'm wondering if are there any more questions, because there's some comments from Lindy, who's joining us all the way from Florida. I was saying this morning, because I think it's still this morning for her. She's put some useful references in the she's put some useful references in the chat. I don't know if Lindy, you wanted to say something a bit more about those.
Well, I got very excited when this conversation about evaluation turned to story, because at 12:30 last night or this morning, whenever that was, I finally submitted an overdue encyclopedia entry on narrative theory in health. And so it was particularly, on my mind, and that's how I had that reference so quick. I just copied it and pasted it straight out of my entry. But the concept of crystallization is a kind of from the communication field. And I feel like it's relevant because it doesn't pit the hard science against the more qualitative story ideas, and it doesn't seek triangulation to prove a point. It rather appreciates the complexity and the mystery and the beauty of lived experiences, of really complicated lives, and things that we know are not easily represented, and it allows the stories to complement the scientific data, and it allows the storyteller to tell a different story at different times, because that also is the case. I mean, you ask me my story of academia today, it'll change if you ask me again tomorrow, probably after I've submitted my final grades for the semester and feel much better about my life. So our perspectives change, and crystallization accounts for all of those things, and still gives us a space to say, there's still a lot of questions to ask here, because I feel like a lot of a lot of the research agenda tends to assume that we can just answer the questions and move on. And I don't think that's appropriate, but I do think crystallization gives us a space to employ all of these different ways of expressing what we're doing while still keeping space for the mystery. So that's my bit on crystallization. Thanks for letting me come over. I mean, all I got was a Zoom link, so you kind of couldn't see me.
It's lovely to have you here. Thank you for making the lengthy journey.
Yes.
I'm very conscious of time, but sorry. I'm conscious of the time, and I would like to see. Oh, I see that Robin's got a question as well. So maybe take Robin's question, then any kind of final comments from the speakers. Robin, you have 30 seconds.
Well, no chance. Very well. It's just some thoughts, I suppose, around thinking about how engaged evaluation can become immanent to engaged research, rather than something that in some way or another comes from the outside, and therefore doesn't replicate our old ways of doing research on, and thinking about how evaluation itself therefore becomes a mode of engagement or a way of doing engaged research, whereas with some of the sort of thinking I was having. But really, obviously I'm overly excited about thinking about this in terms of Nietzsche and creativity, but Nietzsche also wants us to think first and foremost about how values are created, and I in all of this, it seems to me that one of the, if we're thinking in terms of transformation and how the research we do can become transformative, one of the ways I think we would want to do this is to think transformatively about evaluation. And of course, Nietzsche himself talks about the transvaluation of values, and we might even understand that as a transformative way of thinking about evaluation, if that's not pushing things a little bit. But most of all, to think about evaluation as a creative process, and a creative process precisely of value creation, and absolutely, it seems to me that storytelling is exemplary of something like that. But I would really like to think more about what it would be like to think of evaluation in terms of precisely a creative process by which value is created.
So thoughts from our speakers on that, very, very brief thoughts, if it's all right to ask you to be brief.
Yeah, I can just quickly say something on that. Yeah, thanks, Robin. I think imagination and creativity as part of the storytelling approach is really fundamental. And I just put into the chat, the arts at the old fire station have got a really good methodology for doing that if people are interested. We just did a quick rapid review of storytelling methods, so I was really excited it came into the conversation. But these kind of ways in which they are able to bring imagination to bear on issues, and also look at things which are actually about very gradual change in a much more robust way. So allowing people to express things which might remain hidden if they're if we look at quantitative approaches. So I think they're massive benefits, but it's so much about where the starting point is and the assumptions which are made. And I think often the assumptions are that we don't have budget or time for a story collector, which is what is kind of advocated in these approaches, that somebody is tasked with that role of collecting stories throughout this process. And so, it is about being transformative and pushing the boundaries of what's possible, I think.
Katrina or Kristina, if you have any last thoughts on that?
Just to thank Lewis, Kristina, and everyone, because Kristina, if evaluation is learning, well, then I've learned a lot from this seminar on evaluation. And for me, so much of what's said sort of resonates with what I think. And I really like this idea of storytelling, but then that not being the end in itself, that then there is that collective shared, so what happens. And I wonder whether we could think about doing something like that with the centre, and not just at the end of the centre's existence, but doing these events every year to see whether and how the stories change and to inform our learning and practice. Because for me, engaged research must there must be a change element in it, the story we should be able to tell about that. So thank you, everyone.
Yes, Kristina, I don't know if you had any last.
Yeah, I was just reminded of when we used the most significant change technique to ask some researchers about the impact of involvement. One of the researchers said, "It was the moment when I started to see the patients as colleagues. That's when everything changed for me." And how do we evaluate our colleagues? There's something there, I think. We're always talking. I did a PhD in molecular biology. My experiments were designed by the conversations I had in the tea room, in the pub, in the lecture seminar series, all these things. How do we tell the story of our research and the impact that the colleagues had on our ideas? We don't do that very often. I think that's how we need to think about it.
Thank you so much. There's so many interesting things, and I feel like the conversation could probably go on much longer, so I feel very bad about drawing it to a close. But thank you again to our three fantastic speakers. It's been brilliant having you in and sharing those ideas, and I think everyone's going to go with quite a lot to think about. Just want to give a quick shout out again to our next two seminars, which are on the 10th of June, which is the Critical Disability Studies and the Disabled Child, Unsettling Distinctions, and the symposium that is on the 1st of July, which is National Syndromes, Racism, Health, and the State in Pandemic Times. Thank you all so much for being here today. Take care, stay safe, and hope to see you in June, if not before. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting it so beautifully as well, Michael.
Yeah.